The rain hammered against the broken windows of the abandoned warehouse, each drop echoing through the empty space like tiny drums of despair. In the darkest corner, curled beneath a pile of moldy cardboard and torn fabric, lay Serafina Draconis. Once her name had commanded respect across 3 continents. Once her family's golden scales had gleamed in the sunlight of their mountain fortress. Once she had been the heir to the most powerful dragon clan in the modern world. Now she was nothing more than a starving girl hiding in human form, her ribs showing through pale skin that had lost all its supernatural glow. Her long silver hair, once her pride, hung in matted strands around a face that had grown gaunt from weeks of eating scraps and garbage. The transformation that should have been voluntary had become a prison. She no longer had the strength to return to her true dragon form. Serafina pressed her face against the cold concrete floor, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion. 3 weeks had passed since her last real meal. 3 weeks since she had been cast out from her family's estate with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter taste of betrayal in her mouth. Her younger brother Marcus had orchestrated it perfectly. While Serafina had been away studying human business practices in the city, he had convinced their aging father that she had grown too fond of human ways, too weak, too corrupted by mortal influence to lead their ancient bloodline. The evidence he presented was damning and false, but expertly crafted. Forged documents showing her selling family secrets. Fake photographs of her consorting with dragon hunters. Testimony from paid witnesses claiming she had spoken of destroying their kind from within. When she returned home that terrible night 4 weeks ago, she found the great doors of Draconis keep barred against her. Her father, Lord Aurelius, stood on the marble steps in his magnificent golden armor, his ancient eyes filled with disappointment and rage. Behind him, Marcus smirked with satisfaction, already wearing the heir's circlet that had been meant for her. "You have brought shame upon our name," her father had declared, his voice echoing across the mountain peaks. "You have betrayed everything we stand for. From this night forward, you are no daughter of mine. You are cast out, stripped of name, fortune, and family. May you find among the humans the acceptance you seem to crave, for you shall never again know the warmth of dragon fire or the protection of our ancient bonds." The words had hit her harder than any physical blow. She had tried to speak, to defend herself, to explain that everything was lies. But her father's judgment was final. Dragon law was absolute. Once cast out, she could never return. The magical barriers that protected their realm would turn her away, recognizing her as an outsider forever. Marcus had walked her to the borders personally, his smile never wavering. "Enjoy your new life, sister," he had whispered as she stumbled into the human world with nothing. "Try not to starve too quickly. I want you to have time to really appreciate what you've lost." Now lying on the warehouse floor, she understood the full cruelty of his plan. Dragons could survive longer than humans without food, but not indefinitely. In her weakened state, stuck in human form, she was slowly dying. Her supernatural healing had faded. Her enhanced senses were dulling. Soon, she would be no different from any other homeless person on the streets, except that she would die knowing she had once been destined for greatness. The sound of footsteps outside made her freeze. Humans sometimes came to the warehouse looking for metal to sell or a place to sleep. Most ignored her, but some were dangerous. In her current state, she could barely defend herself against an ordinary human, let alone someone with ill intentions. The footsteps stopped near a hole in the wall that served as her usual entrance and exit. A beam of flashlight swept across the interior, passing over her hiding spot. She held her breath, praying the old cardboard would conceal her. "Hello," called a voice, male but gentle rather than threatening. "I know someone's in here. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." Serafina remained motionless. She had learned not to trust kind words from strangers. Humans could be just as cruel as dragons when they wanted something. The footsteps resumed, moving closer. The flashlight beam found her again, this time lingering. "There you are," the voice said softly. "My name is David Chen. I run a soup kitchen about 6 blocks from here. One of my regulars mentioned seeing someone hiding in this old place." Against her better judgment, Serafina lifted her head slightly. The flashlight beam moved away from her face, allowing her to see the person speaking. He was a middle-aged Asian man with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing a simple jacket and jeans. Nothing about him seemed threatening, but she had learned to be cautious. "I'm not going to make you come with me," David continued, crouching down but keeping his distance. "But I've got hot soup and fresh bread at my place. Real food, not handouts or charity with strings attached, just food for anyone who needs it. Serafina's stomach cramped at the mention of food. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. Why? Because everyone deserves to eat, David replied simply. Because I've been where you are, and I know how it feels to think the world has forgotten you exist, and because my daughter would have wanted me to help. Something in the way he said would have wanted made Serafina look at him more carefully. There was an old sadness in his eyes, the kind that came from loss rather than mere sympathy. This was a man who understood pain. I can't pay you, she managed to say, her voice barely audible. I'm not asking you to, David said. He stood up slowly, not making any sudden movements. The offer stands whenever you're ready. David's Kitchen on Maple Street. We serve meals from 5 to 8 every evening. No questions asked, no requirements except that you're hungry. He turned to leave, then paused. There's a storm coming tonight. Weather service says it's going to be bad. If you change your mind about that warm meal, we'll be there. His footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Serafina alone with her thoughts and the growing sound of wind outside. She pulled the cardboard tighter around herself, but it provided little protection against the cold that was seeping through the broken walls. As the hours passed, the storm David had mentioned began to intensify. Rain turned to sleet, then to snow. The warehouse, which had been merely cold before, became brutally frigid. Serafina's human form lacked the natural insulation her dragon body would have provided. She found herself shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so loudly she was afraid they might break. By midnight, she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. Ice was forming on the inside of the windows, and her breath came out in visible puffs. She realized with growing horror that she might actually die here tonight, not from starvation as she had expected, but from the cold. How pathetic would that be? The proud heir of the Draconis clan, dying like a common vagrant in an abandoned building. The irony was almost funny. Dragons were creatures of fire and heat. Cold was their natural enemy, one of the few things that could truly harm them. In her weakened state, the winter storm was as deadly as any weapon her enemies might have used against her. When dawn finally came, pale and gray through the storm clouds, Serafina could barely move. Her lips had turned blue, and her limbs felt like blocks of ice. She knew she had to make a choice: stay here and die with whatever dignity remained to her, or swallow her pride and accept help from a human stranger. The decision should have been easy, but pride was a powerful thing in dragon culture. To accept charity from a human was to admit weakness, to acknowledge that she needed them. Everything she had been taught said it was better to die with honor than live in shame. But as she lay there, slowly freezing to death, she thought about what honor really meant. Was there honor in dying alone and forgotten? Was there honor in wasting the life her parents had given her, even if they no longer wanted her? Her father had cast her out, but he had not ordered her death. Perhaps there was still some purpose left for her to fulfill. With enormous effort, she managed to sit up. Moving was agony. Her joints felt like they were filled with broken glass. But she forced herself to stand, to wrap the least dirty piece of cardboard around her shoulders like a cloak, and to begin the slow journey toward Maple Street. Each step was a struggle. The storm had left several inches of snow on the ground, and her thin shoes provided no protection against the cold or moisture. More than once, she stumbled and nearly fell. Passers-by hurried past her without a second glance, bundled in warm coats and focused on getting to their own destinations. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, she found herself standing in front of a modest building with a simple sign: David's Kitchen, all welcome. Through the windows, she could see warm yellow light and people sitting at tables. The smell that drifted out when someone opened the door was incredible: fresh bread, hot soup, and things she couldn't identify, but that made her mouth water. She stood there for a long time, watching people go in and out. Some were clearly homeless like herself. Others looked like they might be volunteers or staff. Everyone seemed relaxed and comfortable, as if this were truly a safe place. Finally, driven by hunger and cold that had become unbearable, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, so intense after the cold that it actually hurt. The smells were overwhelming, not just food, but coffee and clean soap, and the simple scent of human warmth. Conversations hummed quietly around the room, punctuated by the clatter of dishes and the soft laughter of children. A young woman with a friendly smile approached her immediately. "First time here?" she asked gently. "I'm Sarah, let me show you how things work." Before Serafina could respond, she heard David's voice from behind the serving counter. "Sarah, that's the young lady I told you about, the one from the warehouse." Sarah's expression shifted to one of concern. "Oh my goodness, you're freezing. Come on, let's get you some hot food and dry clothes. We keep extras for situations like this." The next hour passed in a blur of kindness that Serafina had almost forgotten existed. Sarah found her clean, warm clothes from a donation bin nothing fancy, just jeans and a sweater that actually fit, along with proper socks and shoes. While she changed in a small bathroom that was cleaner than anywhere she had been in weeks, the volunteers prepared a meal. When she emerged, David was waiting with a bowl of soup that smelled like heaven. "Vegetable beef," he explained, setting it down at a small table near the kitchen. "Made it fresh this morning, and there's cornbread still warm from the oven." Serafina sat down carefully, almost afraid to believe this was real. The first spoonful of soup hit her empty stomach like liquid gold. It was perfectly seasoned, with tender chunks of beef and vegetables that had been cooked to ideal doneness. The cornbread was equally perfect, crispy on the outside, fluffy on the inside, with just a hint of sweetness. She tried to eat slowly to savor each bite, but her starved body had other ideas. Within minutes, the bowl was empty, and she was looking longingly at the pot on the stove. David noticed immediately. "More?" he asked, already reaching for her bowl. "Don't be shy, we made plenty." The second bowl disappeared almost as quickly as the first. Then a third. David kept bringing food without comment or judgment: more soup, another piece of cornbread, a cup of coffee that was perfectly brewed. It was the first real meal she had eaten in weeks, and every bite felt like a small miracle. As her hunger finally began to subside, Serafina became aware that people were watching her. Not starring or judging, but keeping an eye on her with the gentle concern of those who understood desperation. She realized she must have looked terrible when she came in frozen, dirty, and obviously starving. "Thank you," she said quietly when David brought her a fourth piece of cornbread. "I haven't eaten like this in a long time." "How long?" David asked, sitting down across from her. There was no judgment in his voice, just genuine concern. "Almost a month," she admitted. "I've been eating from garbage cans and food scraps when I could find them." David's expression darkened. "That's too long, way too long. Where have you been staying?" "The warehouse where you found me. I've been there for 3 weeks." "Alone?" When she nodded, he shook his head. "That place isn't safe, especially not in weather like this. We've got a shelter program here. Nothing fancy, but warm beds and 3 meals a day. Would you be interested?" Serafina hesitated. Accepting one meal was one thing, but staying in a human shelter felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "I don't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be," David said firmly. "We're here to help people get back on their feet, whatever that looks like for them. No one has to stay forever, but everyone deserves a chance to figure out their next step somewhere warm and safe." As if to emphasize his point, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and everyone could hear the storm still raging outside. The warehouse would be completely uninhabitable tonight, probably for several days until the weather cleared. "Okay," she said softly, "just until the storm passes." David smiled. "That's all anyone has to commit to, just tonight, and then we'll see how tomorrow looks." Over the next few hours, Serafina found herself drawn into the gentle rhythm of the kitchen. She helped clear tables and wash dishes, partly because she felt she should contribute something, and partly because the activity kept her mind off everything she had lost. The volunteers treated her like she belonged there, including her in conversations and showing her how different tasks were done. She learned that David had started the kitchen 5 years ago after losing his wife and daughter in a car accident. "I was pretty lost for a while," he told her while they worked side by side preparing vegetables for the next day's soup. "Didn't see much point in anything. Then I realized that helping other people was the only thing that made the pain bearable." "What were they like?" Serafina asked. "Your wife and daughter." David's hand stilled for a moment, then resumed their steady chopping. "Anna was a nurse. She could make anyone feel better just by being in the room with them. And Lily. She was 8 years old and believed she could save the world if she just worked hard enough. She was always bringing home stray animals or asking me to donate to some charity she'd heard about at school." "They sound wonderful." "They were. They would have loved this place. Anna would have been bossing everyone around, making sure people were eating enough vegetables. and Lily would have been organizing games for the kids or reading stories to anyone who would listen. There was a comfortable silence as they continued working. Serafina found something deeply soothing about the simple, repetitive task of preparing food. It reminded her of better times in her childhood, when she had sometimes been allowed to help in the kitchens of Draconis Keep. The head cook, a formidable dragon matron named Cordelia, had taught her that cooking was one of the most honest forms of magic, transforming simple ingredients into something that brought joy and comfort to others. The memory brought a stab of homesickness so sharp it almost made her gasp. She missed the vast kitchens with their enormous stone hearths. She missed Cordelia's gruff affection and the way the whole staff would come together to prepare the elaborate feasts that marked important occasions. She missed belonging somewhere, being part of something larger than herself. "You okay?" David asked, noticing her distress. "Just thinking about home," she said quietly, "or what used to be home. Want to talk about it?" For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything, to explain about dragons and magic and family betrayal and the loneliness that felt like it might swallow her whole. But how could she explain something so impossible? How could she make him understand that she wasn't just homeless, but cut off from her entire species and everything that had defined her existence? "Family trouble," she said instead, which was true enough. "I can't go back." David nodded, understanding. Sometimes families can be the most hurtful of all. They know exactly where to aim to cause the most damage. "Yes," she said, surprised by how well he understood. "Exactly that." They worked in companionable silence for a while longer, until the evening meal service began. Serafina helped serve food, marveling at the easy kindness of the volunteers and the grateful dignity of the people they served. Many were clearly regulars who joked with the staff and knew each other's names. Others, like herself, were newcomers who sat quietly and tried to process their circumstances. She found herself studying David as he moved through the room, checking on everyone and making sure no one went hungry. There was something remarkable about the way he treated each person with genuine respect and attention, as if their comfort was the most important thing in the world. She had seen dragons who commanded vast treasures and ancient powers, but none of them had possessed the kind of natural authority that came from simply caring about others. When the meal service ended and the last guests had left for the night, David showed her to the small dormitory area behind the kitchen. It was simple but clean, with 6 single beds and lockers for personal belongings. Only 2 other beds were occupied, an elderly woman who was already asleep and a young man who nodded politely before returning to the book he was reading. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall," David explained quietly. "Towels are in the cabinet. We ask people to be up by 7 for breakfast, but other than that, the time is yours. If you need anything at all, my apartment is right above the kitchen. Don't hesitate to ask." As Serafina settled into the narrow bed with clean sheets and a warm blanket, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: safety. The storm was still raging outside, but she was warm and fed and protected. For the first time since her exile, she fell asleep without crying. She dreamed of Draconis Keep, but for once it wasn't a nightmare. In her dream, she was in Cordelia's kitchen again, learning to make bread while the old dragon told stories of her youth. The kitchen was warm and filled with laughter, and when Serafina looked out the windows, she could see her father flying overhead in his golden dragon form, strong and proud, and not yet turned against her. When she woke, she lay still for several minutes, holding on to the peaceful feeling of the dream. Outside, she could hear the sounds of breakfast preparation beginning in the kitchen. David's voice drifted through the thin walls as he directed volunteers and greeted early arrivals. For the first time in a month, Serafina felt something that might have been hope. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Serafina found herself settling into the rhythm of life at David's kitchen with surprising ease. Each morning, she helped prepare breakfast for the early crowd, mostly construction workers, and office employees who stopped by for coffee and David's famous breakfast sandwiches. The work felt good, purposeful in a way she hadn't experienced since leaving her family's estate. Her dragon heritage meant she learned quickly, her enhanced coordination making her naturally skilled at the precise knife work required for food preparation. David had noticed her abilities almost immediately, though he attributed them to previous kitchen experience rather than supernatural gifts. "You've done this before," he observed on her second morning, watching her dice onions with professional speed and uniformity. "Those cuts are restaurant quality." "I learned from someone very skilled," Serafina replied, thinking of Cordelia's exacting standards. She believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing perfectly. Smart woman, what's her name? Maybe I know her. Serafina's hands stilled for a moment. Cordelia, but she's not in the area anymore. David seemed to sense there was more to the story but didn't press. It was one of the things she appreciated about him, his ability to offer support without demanding explanations. In Dragon society, every conversation was weighted with politics and hidden meanings. Here, kindness seemed to come without conditions. The breakfast rush kept them busy until 10, when David would switch to preparing for lunch service. It was during this quieter time that Serafina found herself really observing him work. His movements in the kitchen were economical and practiced, but there was something else, an almost ritualistic care in the way he prepared each dish, as if the act of cooking itself was a form of meditation. "You really love this," she said, watching him season a large pot of soup with careful attention to each spice. "I do," David admitted. "Feeding people is one of the most basic forms of caring for them. When Anna was sick," he paused, his voice catching slightly. "When Anna was sick, near the end, she couldn't keep much down, but I could still make her broths and teas that gave her some comfort. It was the only way I could still take care of her." The pain in his voice was so raw that Serafina felt her own eyes misting. In her world, weakness was hidden, grief was private, and vulnerability was carefully guarded. But David spoke of his loss with an openness that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "She was lucky to have someone who loved her that much," Serafina said quietly. "I was the lucky one," David replied. 18 years with Honor and 8 with Lily, not enough but more than some people get, and now I can share what they taught me about taking care of others. That afternoon, while David was meeting with suppliers, Serafina found herself in the dining area with some of the regular guests. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who came for lunch every Tuesday and Thursday, was teaching her to play cribbage. Tommy, a young man who worked odd jobs but struggled with addiction, was showing her pictures of his daughter who lived with his ex-wife in another state. "She's beautiful," Serafina said, looking at a photo of a gap-toothed 6-year-old with pigtails. "You must miss her terribly." "Every day," Tommy said, "but I messed up too many times. Karen won't let me see Sophia until I can prove I'm clean and stable. Can't blame her, really. Kid deserves better than what I was putting her through." "What are you doing to change things?" "Got into a program, been clean for 43 days now. Found a job at a warehouse, nothing fancy, but it's steady. David's letting me stay here until I save enough for a deposit on an apartment. Says he believes in second chances." The simple faith in David's voice when he spoke about second chances reminded Serafina of something her father used to say, back when she was young, and he still saw potential in her rather than disappointment. "The measure of a dragon is not in never falling, but in how they choose to rise." She had fallen as far as it was possible to fall, cast out, powerless, reduced to accepting charity from humans, but maybe that didn't have to be the end of her story. Maybe David was right about second chances. That evening, during dinner service, a new face appeared among the regular crowd. He was a tall man with expensive clothes and an air of authority that made several guests uncomfortable. He surveyed the room with calculating eyes, taking notes on a small tablet. "Can I help you?" David asked, approaching with his usual friendly demeanor. "Health inspector," the man replied curtly, flashing a badge. "Routine inspection. I'll need to see your permits and check your kitchen facilities." Something about the man's attitude immediately put Serafina on edge. Her dragon senses, though dulled by her weakened state, still functioned well enough to detect deception. This man's scent was wrong, too clean, too carefully controlled, and there was something predatory in the way he watched David's reaction. David, however, showed no concern. "Of course, everything's in order. Let me show you around." For the next hour, the supposed inspector went through the kitchen with meticulous attention to detail. He found minor violations that David had never been cited for before. A temperature reading that was 1 degree off the standard, cleaning supplies, stored 3 inches closer to food prep areas than regulations technically allowed. A hand-washing sign that was posted at the wrong height. "These are serious violations," the inspector announced loudly, making sure the dinner crowd could hear. "I'm required to issue citations for each infraction. The total fine comes to $12,000. David went pale. 12,000, But these are tiny issues. We've never had problems with inspections before. The regulations are very clear, the man replied, handing over a thick stack of papers. You have 30 days to pay the fines and correct the violations, or this establishment will be shut down. After the inspector left, David sat heavily at one of the tables, staring at the citation papers. The dinner crowd had dispersed quickly after the dramatic announcement, leaving only the staff and a few regular guests who refused to be driven away. This is impossible, David said quietly. $12,000 for violations that would normally get warnings at most, and some of these regulations, I've never even heard of them. Sarah, the volunteer who had first helped Serafina, leaned over his shoulder to read the citations. David, look at this. Half of these regulation numbers don't match anything in the health code, and this inspector's badge number. I used to work for the city. This format is all wrong. You think he was fake? David asked. I think someone wants to shut you down, Sarah replied grimly. The question is who and why. Serafina had been listening from the kitchen doorway, her anger building with each word. She had seen this kind of corruption before, though usually in the context of dragon politics rather than human bureaucracy. Someone with power was using official-looking documents and intimidation to destroy what David had built. What will you do? She asked, joining them at the table. I don't know, David admitted. Even if we prove these citations are bogus, fighting them will take time and money I don't have. And if word gets out that we're under investigation, real or fake, donors might stop giving. Volunteers might stop coming. This place could be finished before we ever get to court. The defeat in his voice broke something inside Serafina. David had saved her life by offering kindness when she was dying in that warehouse. He had given her purpose and dignity when she thought she had lost everything. He was feeding and sheltering dozens of people who had nowhere else to turn. And now someone was trying to destroy all of that for what money? Power? Simple cruelty. In that moment, she made a decision that would have horrified her family but felt absolutely right to her. She was going to help David fight this, using whatever remained of her dragon abilities and knowledge. She had been raised to understand power and politics and the games people played when they wanted to destroy their enemies. It was time to put that education to use for something worthy. Don't give up yet, she said firmly. There might be more options than you think. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Serafina slipped out of the shelter. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she ignored it, focusing on the task ahead. If she was right about what was happening, she needed to understand who was behind it and why. The building that housed David's kitchen was located in a neighborhood that had been steadily gentrifying over the past few years. New condominiums and upscale restaurants were replacing old businesses and low-income housing. It was the perfect setup for someone to want David's operation gone. A soup kitchen and homeless shelter didn't fit the image developers were trying to create. Serafina spent hours walking the surrounding blocks, using her enhanced senses to gather information. Even in her weakened state, she could detect scents and sounds that humans would miss. She noted the expensive cars parked outside certain buildings, the subtle signs of construction and renovation, the way some businesses seemed to cater to a very different clientele than David's kitchen. Just before dawn, her patience was rewarded. She overheard a conversation between two men outside a luxury apartment building 3 blocks from the kitchen. One was the fake inspector from earlier. The other was an older man in an expensive suit. The bleeding hearts won't give up easily, the fake inspector was saying. Chen's got too much community support. Then we escalate, the older man replied. Fire marshal inspection next week. I'm sure we can find some serious safety violations, maybe some anonymous tips about drug dealing or other illegal activities. The city council is already concerned about property values in this area. What if they fight back? With what? Chen's operating on donations and volunteer labor. He can't afford lawyers or private investigators. A few well-placed obstacles and he'll fold. Serafina felt her dragon heritage stirring for the first time since her exile. Not the physical transformation, she was still too weak for that, but the cold, calculating anger that had helped her ancestors defend their territories for thousands of years. These men thought David was helpless because he was kind. They were about to learn that kindness didn't mean weakness, especially when it had a dragon to protect it. She spent the rest of the early morning researching the neighborhood's recent development history using the public computers at the library. What she found confirmed her suspicions. The older man from the conversation was Richard Hawthorne, a wealthy developer who had been buying up properties in the area for the past 2 years. David's building was one of the few he hadn't been able to acquire, and its continued operation as a soup kitchen was probably affecting his ability to market the area to upscale tenants. By the time she returned to the kitchen for breakfast preparation, Serafina had the beginnings of a plan. She also had something she hadn't felt since her exile, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. These people had saved her life and given her dignity when she had nothing. Now she was going to save them in return. "You're up early," David observed when she arrived in the kitchen ahead of the other volunteers. "Everything okay?" "I've been thinking about your problem," she said, tying on an apron. "I think I might be able to help." "I appreciate that, but there's not much anyone can do against this kind of corruption. I've seen it before. People with money and connections can make life very difficult for organizations like ours." "What if you had evidence that the inspection was fraudulent? What if you could prove who was behind it and why?" David paused in his coffee preparation. "Do you know something I don't?" "I know how to listen and where to look," Serafina said carefully. "And I know something about how powerful people operate when they want something. Let me do some digging before you decide to give up." Over the next few days, Serafina threw herself into her investigation with single-minded determination. She used skills learned from years of dragon court intrigue, observing patterns and connections that humans might miss. She tracked the fake inspector's movements, documented his meetings with Hawthorne, and began building a comprehensive picture of their scheme. What she discovered was even more extensive than she had initially suspected. Hawthorne wasn't just targeting David's kitchen. He was systematically driving out every business and organization in the area that didn't fit his vision of upscale development. A community garden had been shut down for zoning violations. A small family restaurant had been forced to close after a series of harassment campaigns. An after-school program had lost its lease when the building owner suddenly tripled the rent. The pattern was clear and ruthless. Hawthorne would identify properties he wanted, then use a combination of legal pressure, intimidation, and financial warfare to force out the current occupants. Once the area was cleared of undesirable elements, he could develop it as luxury housing and commercial space, multiplying his investment many times over. But patterns could be broken, and bullies could be stopped if you knew how to fight them. Serafina had learned a great deal about strategy and warfare during her time as heir apparent to the Draconis clan. The principles remained the same whether you were fighting dragons or human developers. Identify your enemy's weaknesses, gather your allies, and strike where they least expected it. The breakthrough came when she followed the fake inspector to a meeting at Hawthorne's office building. Using enhanced hearing that no human would possess, she was able to listen in on their conversation from the building's lobby. What she heard made her blood boil. "The old man's more stubborn than we expected," Hawthorne was saying. "But I've got a city council meeting next week where I'm presenting my development proposal. A few more incidents at the soup kitchen, and the council will be happy to revoke their permit for public safety reasons." "What kind of incidents?" the fake inspector asked. "Food poisoning outbreak, anonymous tips about health violations, maybe some vandalism that makes the neighborhood look unsafe. Nothing traceable back to us, but enough to build a case that the area needs cleaning up." "And if Chen still won't sell?" "Then we move to Phase 2, eminent domain. I've got friends on the planning commission who can declare the property blighted and force a sale for public improvement. Chen will get a fraction of what the land is worth, and will have a clear path for development." Serafina felt her hands clench into fists. These men were planning to destroy not just David's kitchen, but the entire community it served. All for profit. All because they saw kindness as weakness and compassion as something to be eliminated. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed David was fighting alone. They had never counted on a dragon. The morning of the city council meeting dawned gray and cold, matching Serafina's mood as she put the final touches on her plan. For the past week, she had been working 18-hour days, gathering evidence and building alliances while maintaining her normal duties at the kitchen. The effort was exhausting her already weakened system, but she refused to slow down. Too much depended on what happened in the next few hours. David sat across from her at the small table in his apartment above the kitchen, surrounded by documents and photographs she had compiled. His expression shifted between amazement and concern as he reviewed the evidence of Hawthorne's conspiracy. "This is incredible work," he said, holding up a photograph of Hawthorne meeting with the fake inspector. "But also incredibly dangerous. How did you get access to all this information?" "I know how to be quiet and patient," Serafina replied, which was true enough. "And I know what questions to ask when I find the right people to ask them." What she didn't mention was that those people included a homeless veteran named Frank who had exceptional skills in electronic surveillance, a former city clerk named Maria who still had contacts in municipal offices, and a retired journalist named Patricia who knew exactly which officials could be trusted and which ones couldn't. Serafina had discovered that the community around David's kitchen was far more resourceful and connected than most people realized. They had simply never had someone willing to organize their various talents toward a common goal. "The city council meeting starts in 3 hours, David said, checking his watch. "Are you sure this will work?" "The evidence speaks for itself," Serafina replied with more confidence than she felt. "Hawthorne has been systematically corrupting the inspection and permitting process to drive out businesses that don't serve his interests. The documentation proves fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Even if some council members are in his pocket, they won't be able to ignore this publicly." David nodded, but she could see the worry in his eyes. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, but I'm also scared about what might happen to you. Hawthorne has a lot of power and influence. If he realizes you're the one who exposed him." "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Serafina said firmly. "Right now, let's focus on saving the kitchen." What she didn't tell David was that she had already considered the personal consequences of her actions. By choosing to fight Hawthorne publicly, she was risking exposure of her true nature. Dragons were supposed to stay hidden from human society, operating behind the scenes when they interacted with mortals at all. Taking a public stand against a powerful human developer was exactly the kind of behavior that had gotten her exiled in the first place. But some things were worth the risk. David's kitchen wasn't just a building or a business. It was a sanctuary for people who had nowhere else to turn. It was proof that kindness could exist without conditions, that people could take care of each other simply because it was the right thing to do. If she had learned anything during her weeks of exile, it was that such places were rare and precious and worth defending. The city council chamber was packed when they arrived. News of the meeting had spread through the neighborhood, bringing out dozens of supporters for David's kitchen. Serafina recognized many faces from the dining room. Tommy was there in his best clothes. Mrs. Patterson had brought her entire church group, and Frank the veteran had somehow managed to find a suit that almost fit. On the other side of the room sat Hawthorne and his supporters, well-dressed developers, local business owners who had bought into his vision of gentrification, and several people Serafina didn't recognize, but who radiated the kind of cold professionalism that suggested expensive lawyers. The meeting began with routine business, but everyone knew what they were really there to discuss. When the council chair called for public comment on the David's kitchen permit renewal, the real battle began. Hawthorne spoke first, his presentation slick and professional. He painted a picture of a neighborhood in decline, plagued by vagrancy and petty crime that could be traced directly to the soup kitchen's presence. He had charts showing property values, crime statistics, and complaints from concerned residents about safety and sanitation issues. "The data is clear," Hawthorne concluded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. "This establishment, while well-intentioned, has become a magnet for criminal activity and public health concerns. The responsible thing to do is to allow the permit to lapse and help Mr. Chen find a more appropriate location for his charitable activities." Several council members nodded along with his presentation, and Serafina felt a chill of fear. Hawthorne was good at this. He made his position sound reasonable, even compassionate. Without compelling counter-evidence, David would lose. David stood to respond, and Serafina could see his hands shaking slightly as he approached the podium. Public speaking had never been his strength. His talents lay in quiet, one-on-one care rather than dramatic presentations. But his voice was steady as he began to speak. "Council members, I've been running David's kitchen for 5 years without any significant problems. We've served over 100,000 meals to people in need, provided temporary shelter to hundreds of individuals during their most difficult times, and helped dozens of people transition back to stable housing and employment. The violations cited in recent inspections appear to be. Interrupted Councilman Bradley, one of Hawthorne's known allies. Are you suggesting that official city inspections are somehow inaccurate? David faltered, clearly unsure how to proceed without making accusations he couldn't prove. This was the moment Serafina had been waiting for. She stood up in the gallery and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I have evidence that those inspections were fraudulent. The room erupted in surprised murmurs as she made her way to the front. David looked startled, but stepped aside to let her approach the podium. Hawthorne's expression had gone from confident to alarmed in the space of a heartbeat. "Who are you?" demanded the council chair. "My name is Serafina Draconis," she said, using her full name for the first time since her exile. "And I have documentation proving that Mr. Hawthorne has been using fake inspectors and fraudulent citations to drive legitimate businesses out of this neighborhood." She began laying out the evidence methodically, piece by piece. Photographs of Hawthorne meeting with the fake inspector. Bank records showing payments from Hawthorne's company to individuals with no official city employment. Recordings of conversations where Hawthorne and his associates discussed their plans to manufacture safety violations and health crises. Furthermore, she continued, her voice growing stronger as she hit her stride, I have evidence that this is part of a larger pattern of corruption. Mr. Hawthorne has used similar tactics to force out at least 6 other businesses and community organizations in this area over the past 2 years. The room was dead silent now, everyone hanging on her words. Even Hawthorne seemed too shocked to interrupt. Serafina pulled out her final piece of evidence, a thick folder of documents that Frank the veteran had helped her obtain through connections at the Veterans Administration. These are reports showing that Mr. Hawthorne's development company has systematically targeted organizations that serve vulnerable populations. Veterans services, addiction counseling programs, low-income housing advocates, anyone who might interfere with his vision of an upscale development district. This is outrageous, Hawthorne finally found his voice. These allegations are completely unfounded. I demand to know where this woman obtained private documents and whether any of this so-called evidence was gathered legally. Serafina turned to face him directly, and for just a moment, she let some of her dragon nature show through. A flash of ancient authority and barely contained power that made him step backward involuntarily. Every piece of evidence was obtained through legal means, she said calmly. Much of it consists of public records that anyone could access if they knew what to look for. The rest was provided by citizens who were tired of watching their community be destroyed by corruption and greed. The council chair was studying the documents Serafina had provided, his expression growing grimmer with each page. These are very serious allegations, if these documents are authentic. They can be verified, Serafina interrupted smoothly. I've provided contact information for every source and reference number for every public record. I'm also prepared to submit to questioning under oath regarding how this evidence was gathered. What followed was 2 hours of heated debate, document examination, and increasingly desperate attempts by Hawthorne's supporters to discredit the evidence. But Serafina had done her work too well. Every piece of evidence could be verified, every claim could be substantiated, and the pattern of corruption was too clear to deny. In the end, the vote wasn't even close. David's Kitchen's permit was renewed unanimously, and the council voted to refer the matter of Hawthorne's activities to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. As the meeting broke up, people crowded around David and Serafina to offer congratulations and support. Tommy grabbed her hand and shook it enthusiastically. You saved us, he said, tears in his eyes. You saved everything. Mrs. Patterson hugged her tightly. I don't know who you really are, dear, but you're a blessing, a real blessing. Through it all, Serafina found herself watching David's reaction. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. When the crowd finally thinned out, he approached her with an expression she couldn't quite read. We need to talk, he said quietly. They walked back to the kitchen in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were safely in David's apartment with the door closed that he finally spoke. That was incredible, he said, but it was also impossible. The level of investigation you conducted, the evidence you gathered, the connections you made. That wasn't the work of someone who's been homeless for a month. That was professional-level intelligence gathering. Serafina had been dreading this conversation, but she had known it was inevitable. Does it matter? The kitchen is safe. Hawthorne will face justice. Isn't that what's important? Of course that's important, David said gently. But you're important too, and I have the feeling that helping us has put you in danger, real danger. He was more perceptive than she had given him credit for. Maybe, but some things are worth the risk. Who are you really? David asked. And don't tell me you're just someone who used to work in a kitchen. People don't develop the kind of skills you demonstrated today by dicing vegetables. Serafina was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She could continue lying, make up some story about a background in law enforcement or private investigation. David would probably accept it and never press for more details. But after everything they had been through together, after he had saved her life and she had saved his life's work, didn't he deserve something closer to the truth? My family was, very powerful, she said finally. I was raised to understand politics and power and the games people play when they want to destroy their enemies, but I made some mistakes, trusted the wrong people, and I lost everything. My family cast me out, and I can never go back. It was the truth, just not the complete truth. David seemed to understand that there were still things she couldn't or wouldn't explain. So you used skills from your old life to protect your new one, he said. I can respect that, but are you going to be safe? Will your family try to interfere now that you've taken such a public stand? I don't know, Serafina admitted. But I'm not sorry I did it. You gave me a purpose when I had nothing to live for. You showed me that kindness exists without conditions, that people can take care of each other simply because it's right. That was worth fighting for. David smiled for the first time since the council meeting. Well, then I guess we're even. You saved my life's work and I apparently saved your life. Not a bad trade. That evening, the kitchen held an impromptu celebration. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about their victory at the council meeting, and people kept stopping by to offer congratulations and share stories about what the kitchen meant to them. Serafina found herself in the unusual position of being the center of attention, something that would have been natural to her in her old life, but felt strange now. She was no longer the heir to a dragon clan. She was just a woman who had helped save a soup kitchen. But as she listened to person after person talk about how David's kitchen had changed their lives, she realized that maybe this new role was more important than her old one had ever been. Late that night, as she was cleaning up from the celebration, Sarah approached her with a concerned expression. Serafina, there were some men here earlier asking questions about you. They said they were reporters, but something felt off about them. They wanted to know where you came from, where you learned investigation techniques, whether you had any family connections in the area. Serafina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. What did you tell them? That you were a volunteer and we don't give out personal information about our staff. But they seemed really interested. More interested than reporters would normally be in someone who just helped expose a local corruption scandal. Did they leave any contact information? They said they'd be back. That night, Serafina lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to decide what to do next. The men Sarah described could have been legitimate journalists following up on the Hawthorne story, or they could have been private investigators hired by Hawthorne to find something he could use against her. But there was a third possibility that worried her more than either of those. They could have been sent by her family. Her very public stand against Hawthorne had demonstrated exactly the kind of behavior that had gotten her exiled in the first place. She had involved herself in human affairs, used dragon-enhanced abilities in public situations, and drawn attention to herself in ways that violated every rule of secrecy her people followed. If the Dragon Council had learned about her activities, they might decide that exile wasn't sufficient punishment. But as she looked around the small dormitory where she had found safety and purpose, Serafina realized that she didn't regret her choices. For the first time in her life, she had used her power and privilege to protect people who needed protecting rather than to advance her family's political interests. She had discovered that there was more honor in serving soup to hungry people than there had been in all the elaborate ceremonies and traditions of dragon nobility. Whatever consequences came from her actions, she would face them. She had found something worth defending and people worth defending it for. That was more than she had possessed when she first stumbled into David's kitchen, starving and broken, and convinced that her life was over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Hawthorne still had powerful allies who might seek revenge, Her family might discover where she was and what she had done. The men asking questions might return with less polite intentions. But tonight, the kitchen was safe. The people she had come to care about were protected. And for the first time since her exile, Serafina Draconis felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The first sign of real trouble came 3 days after the city council meeting, during the morning breakfast rush. Serafina was in the kitchen preparing eggs when she caught a familiar scent through the open service window, sulfur and ozone, the distinctive smell of dragon magic. Her hands stilled on the spatula as she scanned the dining room, looking for the source. She found him sitting at a corner table, seemingly focused on a cup of coffee and a newspaper. To human eyes, Marcus Draconis would appear to be just another well-dressed businessman getting breakfast before work. But Serafina could see through his glamour to the cold satisfaction in his golden eyes and the predatory stillness that marked him as a dragon in human form. Her younger brother had found her. Marcus looked up from his newspaper and met her gaze through the service window. His smile was sharp and familiar, the same expression he had worn the night he destroyed her life. He raised his coffee cup in a mock toast, then returned to his reading as if nothing had happened. Serafina forced herself to continue cooking, but her mind was racing. Marcus wouldn't have come alone, and he wouldn't have come without authorization from their father, which meant the Dragon Council knew exactly where she was and what she had been doing. The question was what they planned to do about it. She managed to finish the breakfast service without incident, though she was hyper-aware of Marcus's presence the entire time. He ordered food like any other customer, made polite conversation with Sarah about the weather, and left a generous tip. To everyone else, he was just another satisfied patron. Only Serafina knew she was looking at her executioner. When the morning rush ended and David went to his office to handle paperwork, Serafina slipped outside through the back door. She didn't have to wait long. Marcus was leaning against the wall in the alley, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the urban decay around them. "Hello, sister," he said casually. "You're looking rustic." "What do you want, Marcus?" Serafina kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "Direct as always. I suppose months of living among humans has stripped away what little sophistication you once possessed." He pushed himself off the wall and began circling her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Father sent me to deliver a message." "I'm listening." "Your little performance at the city council meeting has attracted attention. The kind of attention our people prefer to avoid." His voice hardened. "Using dragon-enhanced abilities in public, involving yourself in human politics, drawing media scrutiny to your activities. Do you have any idea how many laws you've broken?" "I helped expose corruption and saved innocent people. I'm not ashamed of that." Marcus laughed, the sound cold and brittle. "Innocent people? They're humans, Serafina, cattle. The fact that you've started thinking of them as equals shows just how far you've fallen." "They're not cattle," Serafina said fiercely. "They're people with hopes and dreams and families. They matter." "And that attitude is exactly why you were exiled in the first place." Marcus stopped circling and faced her directly. "But exile was supposed to teach you humility, not encourage more rebellious behavior. Father is disappointed." "What's he going to do? Exile me again?" "Death," Marcus said simply. "The council has voted. You become too dangerous to leave alive." The word hit Serafina like a physical blow. She had known there would be consequences for her actions, but execution, for the crime of helping humans. "The official charge is treason against dragonkind," Marcus continued conversationally. "Specifically, using supernatural abilities to interfere in human affairs in ways that risk exposing our entire species. The penalty is death, to be carried out immediately." "And you volunteered for the job?" "I drew the honor, yes. Father thought it would be more personal this way." Serafina felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Here, now." "Oh no, much too public. I thought we'd take a little trip somewhere more private. Maybe that abandoned warehouse where you were living before you found your precious humans. Poetic justice, don't you think?" The casual cruelty in his voice triggered something deep in Serafina's psyche. For weeks, she had been weak, diminished, surviving on charity and human kindness. But she was still a dragon, and dragons did not go quietly to their deaths. "No," she said quietly. Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "I'm sorry." "I said no, I'm not going anywhere with you. and I'm not going to let you hurt the people in this kitchen." "You're not going to let me?" Marcus's voice rose slightly. "Serafina, you can barely maintain human form. You have no power, no allies, no resources. What exactly do you think you can do to stop me?" "I can fight." Marcus threw back his head and laughed. "With what? Your newfound cooking skills, your ability to serve soup." But even as he laughed, Serafina was drawing on reserves she hadn't touched since her exile. The weeks of regular meals and human kindness had helped heal some of the damage from her time on the streets. More importantly, she had rediscovered something she hadn't realized she'd lost, a sense of purpose worth fighting for. The transformation began slowly, warmth building in her core as she reached for the power that was her birthright. Her human disguise wavered, revealing glimpses of scales along her arms and the faint glow of inner fire in her eyes. Marcus stopped laughing. "You can't be serious. You're going to expose both of us here. The alley's empty, and you said yourself you came here to kill me. I might as well make it interesting." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Marcus's features. He had expected to find a broken, defeated exile ready to accept her fate. Instead, he was facing a dragon who had remembered her strength and was prepared to use it. "Serafina, be reasonable. You can't win this fight. I'm at full strength and you're barely holding human form. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "The only thing that would be hard would be explaining to David why his alley got torn up," Serafina replied. "But I think I can keep the damage to a minimum." She let more of her true nature show, her human form growing taller and more imposing as draconic power flowed through her. It wasn't a full transformation. She was still too weak for that, but it was enough to remind Marcus that she was not helpless prey. "Last chance, sister," Marcus said, his own glamour beginning to slip. "Come with me quietly or I'll drag you there." "Try it." What happened next would be remembered differently by the few witnesses who caught glimpses of it. A delivery driver saw what looked like two people having an argument that suddenly became violent. A pedestrian walking past the alley's entrance thought she saw a brief flash of impossible light. A cat perched on a fire escape fled when the air suddenly became too hot to breathe. The truth was a dragon fight compressed into human space, a brutal, magical confrontation between siblings that should have been impossible to contain in such a small area. Marcus was stronger, but Serafina was defending rather than attacking, which gave her advantages he hadn't anticipated. She used the alley's walls to her advantage, forcing him to fight in tight quarters where his superior strength was harder to leverage. When he sent a bolt of dragon fire at her, she redirected it into a dumpster rather than trying to absorb or block it. When he tried to pin her with brute force, she used momentum and leverage to throw him into a brick wall. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes, but it left both of them battered and drained. Marcus lay crumpled against the wall, his expensive suit torn and his human disguise barely holding. Serafina stood over him, breathing hard but victorious. "You always underestimated humans," she panted. "That was your mistake. David taught me that strength isn't just about power, it's about knowing what you're fighting for." Marcus struggled to sit up, blood trickling from his nose. "You think this changes anything? The council's judgment stands. If I don't return with proof of your death, they'll send others. Then I'll face them too. Don't be naive. They'll send a full pack next time, maybe father himself. You can't fight the entire clan." Serafina considered this. He was right. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Her family would never stop hunting her as long as they saw her as a threat to dragon secrecy. But she also couldn't abandon David and the kitchen. These people had become her family in a way that her birth family had never been. "Maybe I can't fight the entire clan," she said finally, "but I don't have to fight them here." She pulled out her phone and began typing a quick message to David. "I'm leaving, tonight. That way they'll follow me instead of threatening the people here." "Serafina, wait." "It's the only way," she said firmly. "As long as I stay here, everyone I care about is in danger. But if I disappear again, lead them on a chase across the country, eventually they'll get tired of hunting for one exiled dragon." The sound of the kitchen's back door opening interrupted them. David stepped into the alley, his expression concerned. "Serafina, I heard." "Oh." He stopped short when he saw Marcus on the ground and the obvious signs of violence in the alley. "David, go back inside," Serafina said urgently. "This isn't safe." But David's eyes had already taken in the scene. The damaged walls, the scorch marks that hadn't been there an hour ago, and the way both Serafina and Marcus seemed to be radiating heat despite the cold air. "What exactly is going on here?" he asked quietly. Marcus started to laugh again, a bitter sound edged with pain. "Oh, this is perfect. Your precious human has figured it out, hasn't he? Look at his face. He knows you're not what you pretended to be." "David, I can explain," Serafina began. "Can you?" David interrupted, his voice carefully controlled. "Because right now I'm looking at an alley that looks like it got hit by lightning, and I'm pretty sure I saw your eyes glowing a few seconds ago. So please, explain to me what's going on and why there's a man bleeding on my property." The moment of truth had arrived. Serafina could try to lie, to come up with some plausible explanation for what David had witnessed. But after everything they had been through together, he deserved better than that. "I'm not human," she said simply. "I'm a dragon. My family cast me out for caring too much about humans, and now they want me dead because I helped you fight Hawthorne. This is my brother Marcus. He came here to kill me." The silence stretched for several long moments. David's expression went through a series of changes: disbelief, confusion, and finally a kind of tired acceptance. "A dragon," he said flatly. "Yes, like an actual dragon, fire and wings and hoarding treasure." "Usually, yes, though the treasure hoarding thing is mostly a stereotype." David ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older than his years. "Is there anything else I should know? Are you secretly a princess? Is the kitchen sitting on a portal to another dimension?" Despite everything, Serafina almost smiled. "I was an heiress, actually, and no portals that I know of." "Of course you were." David looked down at Marcus, who was trying to stand. "And what happens now? More of your relatives show up for revenge." "Not if I leave," Serafina said. "I was just telling Marcus I'll disappear tonight, lead them away from here, everyone will be safe." "Like hell you will." David's voice was sharp with sudden anger. "You think I'm just going to let you run off and get yourself killed after everything we've been through?" "David, you don't understand." "I understand plenty," he interrupted. "I understand that you saved my kitchen and probably saved my life. I understand that you've become family to everyone here. And I understand that you think you have to face this alone because that's how you were raised to think." He walked over and helped Marcus to his feet, ignoring the dragon's startled expression. "But here's what you apparently don't understand: family doesn't abandon family. Human or dragon or whatever else might walk through that door." Marcus stared at David as if he had grown a second head. "You're a human. This doesn't concern you." "Everything that concerns Serafina concerns me," David replied calmly. "She's part of my family now, which means your little execution order is about to become a lot more complicated." For the first time since her exile, Serafina felt tears welling in her eyes. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. She had spent her entire life in a family where love was conditional and loyalty was temporary. Now she had found people who would stand by her even when they discovered she wasn't what she appeared to be. "David, you can't fight a dragon clan. You don't understand what you're up against." "Then explain it to me," he said firmly. "All of it. What they want, why they're after you, what we're really dealing with. Because if we're going to figure this out, I need to understand the whole situation." Marcus, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, finally found his voice. "You're insane, all of you. Humans don't fight dragons and win." "Maybe not," David agreed. "But humans are pretty good at finding creative solutions when they're protecting something they care about. And Serafina has been teaching us some very interesting problem-solving techniques." As if to prove his point, the back door opened again and Sarah emerged, followed by Tommy, Frank the veteran, and Mrs. Patterson. They took in the scene quickly: the damaged alley, Marcus's obvious injuries, and the tension in the air. "Everything okay out here?" Sarah asked, her hand resting casually on something in her jacket pocket. "Family dispute," David said dryly. "Serafina's brother stopped by with some bad news from home." Tommy stepped forward, his expression hard. "The kind of family dispute that leaves scorch marks on walls." Marcus looked around at the circle of humans surrounding him, his expression shifting from arrogance to something approaching concern. "You told them? You told humans about us?" "I told them I trusted them with my life," Serafina replied. "And it turns out I was right." Mrs. Patterson patted her purse meaningfully. I may be 73 years old, but I still remember how to handle troublemakers. Dragon or not, anyone who wants to hurt our Seraphina has to go through us first. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. A dragon executioner, faced down by a group of humans armed with nothing but determination and whatever Mrs. Patterson kept in her purse. But as Marcus looked around the circle of protective faces, Seraphina could see him beginning to understand what she had learned during her exile. Sometimes the most powerful force in the world wasn't magic or strength or ancient bloodlines. Sometimes it was simply people who cared about each other enough to take a stand. 2 hours later, they were all gathered around the largest table in the dining room, an unlikely council of war that would have been impossible to imagine just days before. Marcus sat across from Seraphina, his injuries bandaged, and his expensive suit replaced with clothes from David's donation bin. The humiliation of wearing human charity was written clearly across his face, but he was apparently too curious about this unprecedented situation to leave. David had prepared what he called negotiation food: fresh coffee, warm bread, and soup that filled the room with comforting aromas. It was, Seraphina reflected, exactly the kind of gesture that would never occur to dragon nobility, but that somehow made everything seem more manageable. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," David said, spreading out the notes he had been taking as Seraphina explained dragon society. "Your people live in hidden communities all over the world. They've been secretly influencing human civilization for thousands of years, and they maintain their secrecy through a combination of magic and ruthless elimination of anyone who threatens to expose them." "That's an oversimplification, but essentially correct," Seraphina replied. "And the Council has decided that by helping us fight Hawthorne, you've become too dangerous to leave alive because you used dragon abilities in a public forum. The exact charge is using supernatural abilities to interfere in human affairs in ways that risk exposing dragonkind," Marcus quoted. "It's one of our oldest and most serious laws." Sarah, who had been quietly listening to the entire explanation, looked up from her own notes. "But you didn't expose anything. None of us knew you weren't human until you told us. And even now, we only know because we're sitting here talking about it." "The risk was deemed unacceptable," Marcus said stiffly. "Our survival depends on maintaining complete separation from human society." "Does it, though?" David asked thoughtfully. "Because from what Seraphina has told us, your people have been influencing human affairs for centuries. You're just doing it secretly and calling it something else." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "That's different. We provide guidance and direction when necessary to prevent humans from destroying themselves, but we don't involve ourselves in their petty local politics." "What makes our politics petty and yours important?" Tommy challenged. He had been unusually quiet during the explanations, but now his voice carried an edge of anger. "You think saving a soup kitchen that feeds hungry people is less significant than whatever shadowy manipulation you people usually do." "You're human," Marcus said, as if that explained everything. "Your concerns are temporary, individual. Our perspective spans millennia." "So do graveyards," Mrs. Patterson said tartly. "Doesn't mean the dead have better judgment than the living." Frank, the veteran, had been studying Marcus with the analytical gaze he usually reserved for broken electronics. "You know what I think? I think your people are scared." "Scared?" Marcus's voice rose slightly. "Dragons don't fear humans." "Sure you do. You're terrified that if humans really knew about you, we might not be as easy to manipulate as you think. You're scared that we might have our own ideas about how the world should work, ideas that don't include ancient lizards pulling strings from the shadows." The insult would have triggered violence under normal circumstances, but something in Frank's steady, fearless demeanor seemed to give Marcus pause. This was a human who had faced death before and wasn't particularly impressed by supernatural threats. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Marcus said finally. "Maybe not," Frank agreed. "But I know something about command structures and institutional thinking. Your people have been doing things the same way for so long that you can't imagine any other approach working.